series is focused on disability rights and studies. Each year, this seminar series concentrates on a theme to create the scholarly opportunities to learn more about social justice. We hope participation in the seminar series stimulates your curiosity and interest to be deliberately inclusive in your administrative, leadership, advising, mentoring, and teaching. Deepening your understanding of disability is important for everyone, and it is essential to promote the growth and evolution of ETH in addition to the newly green light barrier-free project at ETH. If you have any questions or comments or would like to become more involved in social justice, please reach out to diversity@aveth.eth.ch or visit our website. This year, we have 4 leading experts in disability studies virtually joining us from AVETH, from which 2 already took place. Our speaker today is Professor Dolmage, but before I introduce him, I want to invite you to join our final seminar entitled Against Ableism in Teaching and Scholarship by Dr. Stephanie S. Rosen on November 30th from 5 to 6 p.m. Next, I want to share a few of the guidelines for today's session. There will be multiple communication and material formats for the seminar. We will record the event and make slides available shortly after the live seminar. As you may notice, there will also be automatically generated transcription in English during the session, which works okay, but is not entirely accurate. This will also be saved as a transcription that we will edit and make available shortly after the live seminar. You may also type your questions into the chat box in English or German. We will then read the questions aloud to the speaker in English during the Q&A session. While the chat is accessible for some and even a preference, it is also a barrier for some people. So questions after the seminar can be shared with AVETH or Professor Dolmage directly via email. While we do not anticipate it, any hateful or harmful comment will not be accepted and you will be removed from the Zoom room. Guidelines aside, I want to thank you all for joining this seminar and the entire AVETH team for helping make this event possible. Professor Dolmage's pronouns are he, him, and he is a professor of English at the University of Waterloo, where he is chair of the Equity Committee of the Faculty Association. And he is founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. He is committed to disability rights in his scholarship, service, and teaching. His work brings together rhetoric, writing, disability studies, and critical pedagogy. Professor Dolmage will be presenting today his seminar entitled Academic Ableism, Eugenics, Accommodation, and Design. Please address your questions and comments to Professor Dolmage using the chat box function, and we will get them during the Q&A session. Jay, please begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Tuesday. I want to begin just by saying that I work and live on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people here in Ontario, close to Toronto. The University of Waterloo, where I work and close to where I live, is situated on the Haldimand Tract, which was land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. The Six Nations now has less than 5% of this original land base. In my presentation today, I want to talk about, I've basically broken it up into 3 parts so that I can talk about examining disability in higher education before COVID, during COVID, and hopefully after COVID. I want to lay out, to begin, some of the ways that disability has been historically constructed at our universities. How has ableism come to inflect what we do as teachers and researchers? And the metaphor I commonly use for this approach is the steep steps. Your campus is lousy with stairs, and so is mine, my own campus at the University of Waterloo. On our campuses, we build specific associations with the steps and staircases, having traveled up them many times or having avoided them. But students and faculty and staff alike recognize that these steps have something to say. The university, the steep steps metaphor sums up the ways that the university constructs spaces that exclude. Not only have people with disabilities been traditionally seen only as objects of study in higher education rather than as teachers or students, not only has disability been a rhetorically produced stigma which could be applied to other marginalized groups to keep them out of the university, but the university is also seen still today as performing the societal and cultural function of pulling some people slowly up the stairs, and it arranges others at the bottom of this steep incline. So I have an image to share with you here. I'm just going to share my screen. I have an image to share with you here of steep steps at ETH Zurich. So this is a brutalist staircase. The image shows a side view of a series of crisscrossing suspended concrete staircases with wood railings. There are 3 students who are walking up the stairs. On the right, we have the facade of a building that's also a big concrete form. And the stairs themselves are suspended by huge cylindrical concrete columns. We see 2 of these columns holding the staircase up. There's also a slate colored ramp at the very bottom of the image, but I want to note that it would just take people up to the beginning of the bottom staircase. My point in showing this staircase from your campus is that we can all recognize staircases like these on our own campuses. Another way to think about what the stairs do might be to look at a tweet posted by a student named Sarah Marie de Silva from the University of Hull in the UK. She posted this picture on Twitter showing how she is forced to take in her zoology lectures. When she arrives at the lecture, there's only one place for her to sit, in the doorway at the back of the room. And in this image, we see her in her chair at the back doorway. There's a set of stairs that lead down to a kind of auditorium style classroom with rows of other students all sitting across tables, looking at their laptops, holding their coffees, paying attention to the front of the room. This is what so many of the physical, but also curricular and cultural layouts within higher education actually look like. One second here. Disabled students may be there. They may be able to get into the room, but their access is so clearly an afterthought. Their participation is already minimized. No wonder we're losing so many disabled students. I have one more image to share with you here, and this is also related to ETH Zurich. This is the Striatus 3D printed bridge. Okay, it's a 16-meter long bridge built through an innovative collaboration between the Block Research Group at ETH Zurich and Zaha Hadid Architects in collaboration with concrete 3D printing specialists Incremental 3D. The project utilized custom-made proprietary concrete ink to show how we might build bridges in the future. It's the world's first 3D printed structure of this size. But what I'm struck by, and the image shows a bridge that comes up on 4 sides. So there are big ramps that come up on both sides with kind of sweeping concrete columns and handrails along the sides of them. It looks kind of like a 4-legged spider. But what strikes me about the bridge are the stairs. So instead of a ramp leading up on those 4 sides, what we have instead are stairs, right? They're actually wooden stairs that have been placed within the bridge. As an artistic design, it's a kind of thought piece about the future of design, but it's impossible not to notice its physical inaccessibility. Why does a bridge need so many stairs? And will the future really have this many stairs? I include this image to remind us that it's not just the old traditional buildings on university campuses that are inaccessible, but we also fail to imagine disability into the futures of higher education. And the truth is, the university sorts the population by a medicalized and legalistic definition of ability as effectively now as it ever has. In the United States, nearly 2/3 of disabled students are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years. Just 41% of students with learning disabilities complete post-secondary education. In North America, disabled students are likely to have up to 60% more student debt than other students by the time they graduate. And these statistics are skewed because they only account for the students who receive accommodations. And some studies show that up to 2/3 of disabled students don't receive accommodations simply because their colleges don't know about their disability. A recent study by engineering faculty at the University of Illinois in the States suggested that actually 75% of engineering students underreport disability, so they don't seek accommodations. We know from things like the National College Health Assessment in North America that we have a generation of students who are much more likely to experience higher education as disabling, and at the same time, they're much less likely to seek help or assistance. Even in the wealthiest European countries such as Austria, Germany, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, where higher education is significantly supported by state funding, we know that education opportunities beyond primary and secondary schooling are still seriously lacking for disabled people. A recent study in France also showed that disabled students are proportionally fewer in number to succeed at the upper and graduate levels than the average student. So I think we can say we have a crisis of help seeking around disability, but we're also losing thousands of disabled students every day. And I think this all goes for faculty and graduate colleagues doubly. We don't even try to imagine the ableism experienced by faculty, instructors, or graduate students. And the result then is a culture that demands silence and passing. Of course, the knock-on effect is the attrition and huge attrition of disabled teachers and researchers. So the steep steps is my metaphor for this, and I want to suggest that it's in place for students, but they're also firmly in place and extremely steep for us as teachers as well. Of course, we can't be that surprised when we recognize higher education, and this has been one of the arguments in my work, when we recognize higher education for the last century and a half as a eugenic enterprise. Historians have come to understand that eugenics was a powerful rhetoric as well as a series of practices. And it was built at large universities in North America and Europe, right? These schools provided what's called an opportunity structure for eugenics to become a widespread and transnational social movement. Simply, the teaching of eugenics at North American and European schools markedly sped the growth and popularity of ideas around eugenics. The authors go on to say, so this based on the research of Leland, Golick, and Jones, opportunity structures like these persisted even after eugenics faded as an international movement following the Holocaust. So in teaching eugenics explicitly, or even simply doing things like asking students to record their own family trees, these curricular inclusions created the environment in which eugenics could germinate and grow as a movement. So the actual curriculum at colleges and universities both fueled the rise of eugenics and allowed eugenics to continue to be taught in more subtle and covert ways well after the Holocaust. And if you doubt this, I encourage you to search the historical course catalogs at your own school for the word eugenics. Not only did eugenics actually reshape the North American population through things like immigration restriction, not only did it reshape families through its campaigns for better breeding, not only did it reshape bodies through medical intervention, but it reshaped how we thought about bodies and minds. And academia is implicated very deeply in this history. Academia was the place from which eugenic science, quote unquote, gained its funding, its legitimization, so that eugenicists could undertake massive projects that changed the course of human history. But we see the presence of eugenics persistently to this day when we understand that universities create doctors and special educators and therapists who learn how to rehabilitate or cure disability or how to tokenize and minimally include it. Seeing disability as fixable or eradicable, desiring its fixing and eradication is very, very different from seeing disability as desirable or understanding disability as an identity and culture. In short, educating people to erase or diminish disability ensures limitations on all of our knowledge about bodies and minds. Moreover, the continued struggle to fight for small accommodations for students, staff, and faculty with disabilities also ensures that perhaps we're now in an era of people with disabilities fighting to get the chance to study and learn at all. Educators must recognize both the long history of exclusion and experimentation upon people with disabilities, as well as the more recent history of academic ableism experienced by disabled students. And I think we can use steep steps as a metaphor for this ableism. but also recognize that the staircases reach all the way back to the eugenics era. Steep steps, of course, have been a huge part of back to campus planning around COVID-19 as well. All of a sudden, administrators have to look at their buildings differently in 6-foot increments that don't easily fit in crowded stairwells and don't fit at all in elevators. And the steps, the temporal steps of going back to school have forever changed. Who will have a choice about teaching or learning in person on campus? Who will get to choose to work and learn from home? Who will have the right to do so? What social and student-centered spaces will replace physical ones like these steps, and who will be included and excluded? How is teaching changed? Just by moving many of the steep steps online with the same demands of student time and productivity, but without the overhead costs of buildings and classrooms. What regimes of individualization, self-responsibilization, and personal wellness are being put in place? What new regimes of control and surveillance have been built or are being built? Since COVID, so many of the community supports that used to be in place on campus are gone. As a recent article on students with disabilities in COVID concluded, barriers have changed. Here in Ontario, quote, among faculty, a full 4 in 5 agree that the university's pandemic response has had a negative impact on their teaching ability or ability to convey important learning material to students. So during COVID, we see a different relationship between disability and teaching, one in which I hope we can better understand the disabling impact of education. Looking at these steep steps in a world in which COVID has changed how we think about buzzwords like community is jarring, but also in a world in which the prevalence of overt and systemic racism needs to be foregrounded in all that we do, we have to understand that these steep steps disproportionately impact students of color. I know that many colleges and universities have been working hard to address racism on campus. There have been specific incidents, but there are also systemic issues. For example, we know that in the US, African-American males are disproportionately placed in the categories of special education that are associated with extremely poor outcomes at the K-12 level. Yet Joy Banks has shown that African-American students with disabilities experience difficulty accessing disability support services and appropriate accommodations at colleges and universities. So for the same group of students, a disability diagnosis in the K-12 level can be hastily applied and will speed them into the school to prison pipeline. And at the post-secondary level is so much more difficult to get. Further, multiple studies show that minoritized students, specifically Black and Hispanic students, exert more effort and are more engaged than their white peers, but get lower grades. Teachers absolutely have to understand that these differences change the social and the educational geography on campus. These are steep steps that we need to better understand and address. So that's what I urge you to do and think about right now. What are the barriers that are in place on your campus? Not just architecturally, but in the curriculum, in the culture. What are the forces that tell students that they shouldn't seek help or assistance or the accommodations that they have the legal right to, right? How should we map campus now that a lot of these barriers have moved online? That's the first piece of the talk. So in my work, I also look at some of the means we've been given over the last few decades to address some of these inequities, right? And the retrofit is the metaphor that I use for that, those means we have for addressing the steep steps. Right? To retrofit is to add a component or accessory to something that has already been built, right? And a retrofit doesn't make the product function. It doesn't necessarily fix a faulty product, but it acts as a sort of correction. It adds a part in place of an older part, right? And it allows the product to measure up to new regulations. So automobiles or factories are retrofitted with new parts so that they can pass new guidelines. A building is retrofitted to accommodate disability as per the specs of disability law, and ramps are added onto the side of a building or around the back. A perfect distillation of the retrofit mentality might be found, again, at ETH Zurich. What I'm showing you here is the Scuo Bro stair climbing wheelchair, okay? In this image, ETH researcher, sorry, I just have to move this so I can get to this. ETH researcher Pascal Buchholzer sits in the Scuo Bro in front of ETH Zurich's main building. The chair seems to be controlled remotely by fellow researcher Bernard Winter behind him, who stands behind pressing some sort of controller. Instead of removing stairs or building ramps, this chair climbs the stairs itself. The chair appears to have a cantilevering system that would allow the individual sitting in the chair to remain upright as the chair goes down the stairs, though one would have to imagine that there would be a substantial bump each time the wheels move down a step. Inventions like this and the accompanying argument that it would be better to create stair climbing wheelchairs than build ramps or elevators, or simply to create level entrances to more buildings, actually distill perfectly what happens when disability is accommodated in higher education. Because a ramp, even when it's mainly used by disabled people, exists in the public sphere. But a primary message around accommodation is that disability is actually isolating and individuated, right? Something located within a single and singular body. The demand is that that one body be adapted to a curriculum or structure or terrain that is otherwise unwelcoming, inaccessible, and inhospitable. The climbing wheelchair may not even be very good at driving on anything but stairs. It may not be particularly safe to use on most stairs anyhow. It may be big and ugly. It's likely tremendously expensive. But these are all expected outcomes and seem like reasonable problems or burdens for the individual disabled body to deal with in an ableist culture. And that's how retrofitting works. And it's all over our design of teaching, even if it may be harder to recognize. You, disabled student, adapt yourself to my inaccessible pedagogy so that I don't need to dismantle my steep steps. We're all becoming much more aware of this retrofitting in the COVID-19 era. Restaurants and buildings have plexiglass walls built. Tables and chairs are now a measured distance apart. On university campuses, retrofits can include ramps that are placed around the back of the building, or buildings in which the only elevator is also a freight elevator. On the syllabus and within the curriculum, we similarly create access. I'll stop sharing so we can see one another again here. 1 second. I can. Maybe I can. Yeah, hold on. So, okay, so most often, okay, on the syllabus and within the curriculum, we similarly create access, but only in minimal ways, and often in ways that can further stigmatize students. Most often, the only time disability is spoken or written about in class is in the final line of the syllabus, when students are referred to the Office of Disability Services should they desire assistance. The message to students, of course, is that disability is a supplementary concern, and that it's not the teacher's concern or really part of the course. It's at the back door of the syllabus. And to begin with, the truth is that there's such a limited range of accommodations offered. More than 3/4 of the accommodations offered are the exact same thing: extended time on tests and exams. And if, like me, you don't offer tests or exams in your classes and never in a timed way, fine. But if you keep working with disability services and they keep offering this accommodation, then we're doing something dangerous there, in fact, right? That ramp is going to lead students nowhere. We need a much broader repertoire of accommodations. In labs and classrooms where we rarely give tests and we rarely lecture, we must work to expand the range of accommodations that can be offered to students. We argue for innovative teaching methods that move beyond lecturing, that include, experiential learning, hands-on learning, collaboration, all of these things. But we continue to work with a really narrow range of accommodations, and that's really problematic. The accommodations stay stuck in a Fordist educational regime where rigidity and uniformity and timing reign supreme. And that brings us closer to what we might call malicious compliance, where following the letter of the accommodation law actually hurts the student. That said, these retrofitted adjustments are still legally mandated, and we need to continue to offer them. But how can we allow retrofits to become permanent? What are some of the ways that in higher education we've taken accommodations that were made over time and turned them into mainstream pedagogical techniques? How could we do more? How do we do more of that? We've had an opportunity over the last 16 months to do some redesigning of higher education in ways we never have before. Yet, unfortunately, very few people were talking about accessibility as part of that process. We spent much more time investing in surveillance test proctoring software than we spent developing alternatives to outdated teaching models that relied on testing. And just as disabled people were left out of many COVID social support programs, and at the same time were being spoken about as disposable citizens, disabled students and people were not at the table when plans were made for emergency online teaching. There's some irony, of course, that the ableist demands for physical attendance and participation that we used to cling to so tightly have been so easily left behind. Asking to have a grade converted to credit rather than a numerical grade, asking for an extended deadline, getting extra time on a research grant or a tenure deadline, all of a sudden anyone who wanted those things could have them. And disabled people can hardly count the number of times they were denied these things and stigmatized for even asking about them. For example, as we were forced to pivot online, we learned how to caption video maybe, or how to provide transcripts, or how to share these things so that students could access them anytime. In a recent study of engineering students with disabilities at the University of Illinois, results from 303 responses from 49 different courses showed that students with disabilities have always wanted these recorded lectures as videos with transcripts, that they've always wanted course textbook and instructor notes and slides that they could engage with offline. COVID has forced us to do that, right? And these are all things we began to really offer quite broadly during COVID. The key, I guess, is to keep doing this, even when we move back into the physical classroom, and that would just be a very small place to start, but a place to start nonetheless. My challenge to you is to think even more about the barriers students might be facing right now. Also, what are the workarounds? How have we built accessibility into online learning? How will we need to retrofit our teaching in ways that remove barriers as we slowly return to campus? And how will these sync with our own access needs and with our own safety? And that issue of our own safety is something I'd be glad to talk about during the question period. I had a big chunk of the talk about this issue and about the right to remote work for faculty, staff, and students with disabilities that I've had to cut out just for time today, but be glad to come back to. So like in the fairy tales of the Three Little Pigs or Goldilocks and the Three Bears, universal design becomes our third image or metaphor. Instead of stairs that only some people can climb and the message that sends, the center of a universally designed space and its central message are about accessibility for all bodies. Instead of retrofits that are minimal or temporary, or that force disabled people to adapt themselves like the stair climbing wheelchair, universal design adapts the environment and all that we design for the broadest possible range of bodies and minds. And I believe that should really matter for an institution of higher learning, especially an innovative school like mine or like yours. As Ronald Mace wrote, quote, "Universal design is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design." This was at first an architectural movement that worked against the exclusion of people with disabilities, but it also has become a pedagogical movement, right? And we can find echoes of these goals in the recently greenlit Barrier Free at ETH Zurich project. The idea behind the project is to ensure that, quote, "everyone, as far as possible, with or without disabilities, is able to access the university." As Mace and his team discovered, quote, "many of the environmental changes needed to accommodate with people with disabilities actually benefited everyone. Recognition that many such features could be commonly provided and thus less expensive, unlabeled, attractive, and even marketable laid the foundation for the universal design movement." All right, I'm going to show you another slide here. Okay. These are the principles then of universal design for learning. The first piece is multiple means of representation. In universal design language, one of the wordings for this is positive redundancy, right? So giving learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge. Example of that can be transcripts, right? An example of that can be closed captioning. An example of that could be, for instance, today providing a copy of my slides and my notes on another site, right? Having a video of this talk that has captions and transcription up so that people can come and access this later. right? Multiple means of representation in the classroom often means extending outside of the 50 minutes or 90 minutes that you spend together to be sure that students can come back and access that information when they're ready to learn. Multiple means of expression, the second piece, is a way to provide learners alternatives for demonstrating what they know. And I'm going to get into a little bit of a soapbox rant in a minute around time tests and exams, which I think are the worst way to provide learners the means for showing what they know. And thus they give instructors really bad information and feedback about how effectively we've taught, right? Finally, multiple means of engagement is just how we tap into learners' interests, offer appropriate challenges, and increase motivation. So moving beyond simply, and I realize I'm guilty of it here, the modality where the teacher is talking at the front of the room for most of the time. Okay, so that's universal design. That's our like perfect porridge in the three little Goldilocks and the Three Bears metaphor, or it's the brick house, right? In the Three Little Pigs. The belief in the disability rights movement was that a critical reinscription and remapping of social and educational space was necessary, right? That disability was in part being constructed, and in a negative way, by the ways that we taught, by the ways that we built our spaces. Another push behind this movement was the idea that ignoring the centrality of disability perpetuates an injustice against more than just a small group of people, right? I want to point out here that universal design is a list and is applied solely to the physical environment. Looks a lot like just a checklist or a set of specifications. But imagine if we conceptualized all structures, even huge institutions like universities, as changeable spaces, not as built spaces, but as spaces that we're designing and redesigning as we move through them, as we interact with them. And what if we thought of them from the beginning as spaces that had a responsibility to the broadest possible spectrum of users, and that thought of users as moving across embodiments throughout the course of their lives? Importantly, I think that universal design allows us to understand disability from a justice perspective and a cultural perspective, rather than a legal and medical one. It asks us to foreground intersectionality. It means that we understand that disablement disproportionately impacts people of color, for example, and that we never forget that. It also means that we listen to disabled students and allow them to shape education, rather than privileging only service professionals. It means that the goal is not a better university just for disabled people, but for everyone. For the last decade, I've been working on creating a long list of universal design ideas. And I'll show you, there's a link to that here. And I call it places to start, right? So you have a link here, and this is also up on the WordPress site, and I'll cut and paste these into our chat, but an open access version of my book, Academic Ableism, but also a link directly to these universal design ideas for teaching. And there are thousands of them there. And I guess I have an evangelical take on this, which is, I want to challenge you all to visit that site and to pick a universally designed teaching technique to try. And they apply to labs, traditional classroom spaces, small classrooms, collaborative learning, field trips, everything, right? I also hope that in our discussion period that we can hear some examples of accessible teaching that people already use. We have to share these ideas, I think, and reward one another for the teaching that we do. As I near the end of the presentation, I also want to offer 3 specific challenges that are informed by universal design. I spent the majority of this talk identifying pretty difficult problems, historical ones, and the ways that these historical attitudes shape current realities. But I think that our recent pivot in teaching in higher education could allow us to redesign and rethink several key components of teaching and curriculum and pedagogy that, for whatever reason, our conservatism and orthodoxy previously made it impossible for people to touch. And I think if we make some noise around these things right now, we can take an active role in reshaping our post-COVID future. And we can design a better university. The first thing is help seeking. And I realize the word help is not the right word here, right? Access to accommodations, access to the legal right to an education, right? Students who have these things are not utilizing it, right? And we know that students who do access accommodations do so only in their third or fourth year of university. We see, because I went through the statistics, just how poor the retention is for disabled students, how much more debt they have to carry, how difficult it is to have to negotiate and renegotiate accommodations over and over and over again. Students are having to invent and reinvent these stair climbing wheelchairs to access the curriculum class after class, right? We also know that we have a generation of students who seek help less than previous generations. The student engagement and health surveys show us that. And we also know that these students experience poor mental health in general more than in previous cohorts. This impacts students of color even more than others. So we need to develop an entrance to help and assistance in learning that doesn't have barriers and steep steps. We need to rethink what that help looks like, right? We need to see our classrooms as possible entryways. We need to develop this entrance online as well as on campus, and we need to be creative. We need our services for disabled students to foreground disability justice, not just minimal accommodations. And that means asking disabled students to design these systems, develop them in ways that understand systemic racism, that are not focused only on legal minimum accommodations, but that are focused on the flourishing and success of disabled students, and an understanding that we need permanent systemic changes. Speaking of those permanent systemic changes, I think one of the big pieces for us as instructors is to drastically rethink things like attendance and participation, right? During COVID, I think we realized it isn't fair to grade participation based on quantity, because we just don't know the context that students are learning in. Well, we've never known. So I want to suggest that we should shift towards giving students options to tell us the different ways that they can contribute in valuable ways, and move more to quality rather than quantity, not counting up the number of times they show up for class or the number of things they say. And importantly, admitting that not everyone can learn what they need to in 50-minute chunks of class time. So what are the options we're going to offer students after COVID to learn and to show what they've learned? In a connected way, then, the final thing I want us to re-examine is assessment of student learning. And it's a big piece, it's a systemic piece. But how can we pull back on testing and increase teaching? How can we assess less and teach more? How can we prioritize engagement instead of content? In the winter term of 2020, most Ontario universities like my own allowed students to choose credit or non-credit grades. And then for some strange reason, even though fall of 2020, winter of 2021, fall of 2021 were more stressful and difficult and risky and dangerous, this offer was rescinded. So we need to ask then, what do grades actually do for us? And why do we let them back in our classrooms in the same way? Why do we time exams and tests at all? We removed time testing and we altered our exams for only one term. And now universities are spending millions of dollars on complicated test proctoring services just so we can give the same old timed exams. I guess I'm asking why we should ever go back to assessing one another the way that we used to. Should any of those forms of Fordist assessment that hung around since the mid-20th century be allowed to hang around any longer? Okay, so thanks for your time today. I hope we can talk more about how to continue to design an alternative future for higher ed. I think we can all agree that before COVID, our schools had too many unnecessary barriers in place for students. During COVID, we all viewed and experienced new barriers, or we've seen old ones from new perspectives. And I do believe, and I hope it's not too optimistic or Pollyanna-ish, but I do believe we have a chance now to build something different.